Cool. Could you explain to us, sorry, focusing on your face a little bit, geographic differences between Holyoke, Springfield, Amherst, Northampton, and maybe some of the causes of those?
So Holyoke and Springfield and Amherst and Northampton are remarkably close to each other geographically, but they are very different in terms of their education. One of the things to think about with education is not so much the mileage differences, but the community or neighborhood differences. Public schools in general are paid for by property taxes. It's part of how our kids get to go to school for free, is that our taxes pay for it. Holyoke and Springfield are much more run-down communities. They are working class communities that didn't really survive the shift in industry when the nation moved away, broad brushstrokes here, when the nation moved away from manufacturing and from industry. Holyoke and Springfield didn't rebound terribly quickly, and that brings your property values down, which means there's less money going into education. Now, I don't think money solves everything, but certainly if we're looking at it through the lens of economics, money is a contributor to the potential quality of education. Not the actual quality, but the potential quality. A place like Northampton builds itself up, and Amherst certainly has an historical legacy. We've got the universities, right, which means there is a fair amount more money in these communities. You have a different population, right? We have professors throughout Northampton and Amherst who are going to expect more of their education, for their children. So even though we are so incredibly close to these other communities, the differences in the economics have a very close connection to the differences in educational quality.
You say those reflect socioeconomic status? Are you saying they mirror them?
I wouldn't go so far as to say they mirror them, but they certainly are connected to them. It is not a direct reflection, because there are incredibly good teachers and incredibly smart students and incredibly invested families in Holyoke and Springfield. And there's probably not great teachers in Amherst and Northampton. It's not an immediate automatic reflection. It's a bigger picture. We're not looking at the moment to moment, the day to day. We're not looking at the individuals here. We're looking at bigger information, broader information.
Do you know any specific programs, policies, initiatives that have been giving more resources to communities like Holyoke and Springfield?
There are federal policies such as Head Start, which gets young children around the ages of, say, 3 to 5 into programs at an earlier age. There's a lot of research that says that when children start reading and speaking and engaging in various forms of communication at a younger age, that contributes to their brain development, and that some of the early childhood initiatives have positive ripple effects later on in life. That what you're doing in terms of your early literacy at age 3 can really have an impact on your literacy in grade 8 or 10, right? And so those are federal policies. Those aren't necessarily specifically to Springfield or Holyoke, but those certainly do have a contribution. There's certainly the idea of early childhood nutrition, right? Our brain is the hardest working muscle in our body. If we're not fortifying it with healthy food, what are we doing? So I think one of the things that I'm bringing up with that is none of this happens in isolation, right? Holyoke and Springfield are also areas that are known to be food deserts. Holyoke, I think, is definitely changing this, but there's the families there who might need public transportation don't live within easy access to healthy and nutritious food. And so all of these work together. It's never one singular thing. There's a lot that gets combined. So the idea for mothers in particular to have greater access to nutrition for their infant children and their toddler children can certainly contribute to their child's classroom learning, their ability to focus in school, to not be hungry. If one is hungry, that's what one is thinking about.
How do these factors shape the educational experience of someone in Springfield and Holyoke?
I think you learn from a very young age that, particularly if you're paying attention to the news, that you're considered less than. That you don't have automatic access to certain resources. But at the same token, I think there's something to be said for the flip side of it. When the system works for you, you don't notice that it's there. When education, when transportation, when food, when these things work for you, you don't necessarily notice that it's there. For those of us that do not have mobility issues, for those of us who are able-bodied, we don't notice if there's not an elevator. We don't notice if there's not an accessible entry. We don't notice if there's not an accessible bathroom because the system works for us. I think once we see that the system doesn't work for us, we start to see the cracks in it. And when we see that our education, and I don't know if we see this right away, I don't know if we see this as a child in a classroom or if we look back and see it later, looking back on our education. But when we see that our education is potentially keeping us boxed into a certain location, we might notice that we don't have the opportunities that others have. And then maybe we say, why? What is it that makes me less valuable? And once we begin to think of ourselves as less valuable as human beings, we might accept that treatment. And that's, I think, pretty dangerous.
How can towns like Springfield and Holyoke be close to UMass, but then the demographics of those towns aren't reflected in a college at UMass? Like, can you explain, or what are the underlying reasons as to why college access in Springfield and Holyoke are lower than that of Northampton and Amherst?
My guess is, some of that I would put the responsibility on a place like UMass or Smith or Hampshire or Mount Holyoke, is to what is the outreach? What are we doing here at UMass to reach out beyond, certainly UMass reaches out beyond Northampton and Amherst. I mean, we're a Tier 1 research institute. We're internationally known. We're a solid education. But I do think the responsibility to some extent is on UMass to say what more can we do in terms of our outreach, in terms of the opportunities that we can create and construct for our neighbors, for our community. But I think the responsibility within communities of Holyoke and Springfield is to work against some of these destructive policies, to be a community, to get, and I think both of them do this extraordinarily well. I think it might be time for the rest of us to pay a little bit closer attention to it. But to work together as a community to say, to have a better understanding of what maybe a state takeover of a school system is, to have a better understanding of the implications of high stakes testing, to make collective, comprehensive demands of our legislators. We are in an election cycle right now. What are our legislators going to do in our communities? And I think, there's the cliche that all politics are local. And I think that really comes true when we're looking at our neighborhoods. What can we do and what should we demand of others to do on our behalf?
You mentioned destructive policies. Could you give some specific examples?
I think our emphasis on high stakes testing is extremely damaging to our students, to students across the spectrum, not just students in struggling communities. There's nothing inherently wrong with testing. There are plenty of things I think it's really good that we take tests for. I like that people have to take a test to get a driver's license. That feels pretty good. I like being on the road knowing that everybody else had to go through that process. They had to learn something and then be tested on it. I think the problem is that when we measure the quality of a human being based on the test, when we say that you are a better human being because you do better on a test. I think the destructive policies of relying on testing without corresponding standards. We have a testing system in this country that relies on the results of the testing that doesn't have a corresponding set of standards. And I think that is incredibly destructive, that we measure our teachers' quality by the testing of their students. I think is damaging to teachers. I think we are living in a time where unions are being undone. I would not sit here and argue that unions are perfect and flawless, but unions do protect people from arbitrary, impulsive decisions. And when people feel protected in their workplace, it's better to go to work when you feel like you're protected. And then I would think that if you have a more secure workplace, then you're a more secure worker. And maybe that means that you are a more secure in your teaching. Teachers deserve to have the opportunity to work with their students, not with a testing policy. The testing policy has very little to do with the particularities of each student.
When a state takes over a school, what happens to testing policy?
Testing policy is federal. You guys are going to edit this?
Yeah, we just don't want that.
No, I know. This thing, I don't understand it, to be honest with you. It just randomly does that. I have no idea why. It does it all day long. I think it's breaking, and that's how it's telling me it's breaking, so mostly I just turn it off. So I'm sorry, if you wanted to ask that again.
Can you describe what a federal takeover of a school means?
It's not a federal takeover of a school necessarily so much as a local takeover, right? Because schools in our country are... there are certainly federal policies such as No Child Left Behind or Race to the Top, but most of our public schools are state-run, or state-organized, I should say. So when the state takes over, it means that the upper levels of administration at a particular school have less control and less direct connection with their students, that it becomes an administrative role, and generally speaking from a distance, right? We think that our principals, I think we believe that our principals are in schools every day, right? That they are in their offices, they are walking the halls, they are in classrooms, they may be in the lunchroom, etc. When you have a state takeover, that person isn't in the school in the same, the same continuous capacity. So a takeover means that there's an outside resource that is, or an outside administration that is monitoring the work of the school. And that, I think, starts to kind of break apart some of the collaborative work and the community that a public school is, at least in theory, sort of built around.
I actually saw something last night that was explaining how some charter schools are taking some public funding away from public school.
Yes, it's not just some charter schools. Charter schools take public funding.
How do you feel about charter schools?
I have to say that I'm really torn. And in general, I am, on a theoretical level, on a practical level, I'm opposed to charter schools for a lot of different reasons. They do take public funding. They get to, usually they're operated by some sort of lottery system, which means they get to pick their students, which means that students with special needs are generally speaking left out. Students with certain learning disabilities can be left out of that. Teachers do not have to have any particular education training. Public school teachers have to have teaching licenses. Individuals who teach at charter schools don't necessarily have to have that training. There is no union, which means the teachers are less protected. That's problematic for me. And yet, sometimes charter schools are built in an area where that is going to be an incredible education for them. And your third grader, your fifth grader doesn't know necessarily, doesn't have any necessarily concept of the policy, but they've been given a chance at a better education. I have a hard time saying, oh, well, because of these politics, you don't deserve a better education. Like, I can't do that in clear conscience, but I do think the policies and the politics of charter schools are harming our public schools. And for me, it's why can't those resources and that energy and that focus go into public schools?
How about vocational schools?
Vocational schools, I think, are great. Most vocational schools that I know of, at least, are public schools that have been given this title. I mean, there's the opportunity for job training. There's the opportunity for a set of skills that are being learned, which means that a student graduates from high school with a high school diploma, hopefully a well-rounded education. Obviously, that's both student and school dependent, and a set of skills to be a productive member of the workforce. And if that means that you now do work and get a paycheck that helps you get to college without being crippled by debt, excellent. excellent. I think that vocational schools get a bad rap because it means that there's this idea, I think, about them that you learn this one particular set of skills and that's all you're good at. I don't think that's very fair. I also think vocational schools took a big dip once we started having much more technology, because vocational schools traditionally were very much about physical manufacturing work or some sort of physical embodiment, industrial embodiment. And now that our industry has changed, I think vocational schools kind of got caught up in that and are sort of reinventing themselves. But I think if we have the opportunity to have a skill that enables us to get a productive job that might give us health benefits and retirement, and maybe we can save some money to go to college, and again, as I said before, not be crippled by debt, excellent. Excellent.
Do you think we have? Cool.
I think we're good.
Awesome.
Yeah. That was mostly just for myself. I'm really interested in vocational schools.